Welcome back, dear listener. Tonight, we're drifting through the fog-shrouded streets of a town that exists between waking and sleeping, between memory and nightmare, between what we know to be real and what we fear might be true. This is a complete timeline of Silent Hill, a chronicle that spans centuries of darkness, decades of personal torment, and moments of revelation that reshape our understanding of guilt, punishment, and the power of the human psyche to manifest its deepest fears. From the sacred grounds of indigenous peoples who understood the land's unique properties, through the fervor of colonial settlement and religious extremism, to the modern psychological horrors that have made this small resort town infamous, we'll trace every thread, every connection, every quiet tragedy that has contributed to Silent Hill's transformation from a place of healing waters to a nexus of supernatural judgment. The story we're about to explore isn't merely about monsters and fog, though both play their parts. It's about how places absorb human emotion, how trauma echoes through generations, how the desire for paradise can create hell, and how the mind's attempt to protect itself from unbearable truths can reshape reality itself. Each person who enters Silent Hill experiences a different town, one crafted from their own fears, guilt, and unresolved pain. So settle in, adjust your blankets, and let your breathing slow as we begin this journey into one of horror's most psychologically complex mythologies. Feel free to leave a like if these stories help you find rest, and share in the comments what time it is where you're listening. There's something beautifully appropriate about people around the world simultaneously entering this dreamlike narrative as they drift toward sleep. Let's begin our descent into the complete Silent Hill timeline. The Ancient Foundation. Long before European settlers arrived with their ambitions and their god, the land that would become Silent Hill was known to the indigenous peoples of the region as a place of unique spiritual significance. The native tribes, whose specific names have been largely erased from historical records through deliberate colonial suppression, called this area the Place of Silenced Spirits, or in some translations, where the river grows silent. The indigenous peoples understood that this land existed at a confluence of spiritual energies, a thin place where the boundaries between the physical world and other realms grew permeable. They performed rituals here not to worship, as later settlers would misunderstand, but to maintain balance, to keep the spiritual forces in harmony. The lake at the center of the valley was considered particularly sacred, its waters believed to reflect not just physical images, but spiritual truths. These early inhabitants spoke of the land's ability to respond to human consciousness, to shape itself according to the hearts of those who dwelt upon it. This wasn't seen as malevolent, but as natural, even beneficial when properly understood and respected. Healing ceremonies were conducted on the shores of the lake, where the sick would confront manifestations of their illnesses in symbolic form, achieving cure through spiritual reconciliation rather than mere physical treatment. The arrival of European explorers in the early 1600s marked the beginning of a fundamental misunderstanding that would have consequences echoing through centuries. These newcomers, guided by rigid religious doctrine and cultural assumptions, interpreted the indigenous practices through their own lens of witchcraft and devil worship. Where the natives saw balance and respect, the colonizers saw paganism that needed to be eliminated. The systematic displacement of the native population occurred through typical colonial methods: disease, broken treaties, and forced relocation. But something unique happened in this particular valley. As the indigenous peoples were driven from their ancestral lands, some of their spiritual leaders performed a final ritual, not as a curse, but as a warning. They spoke of the land becoming unguarded, of the spiritual forces losing their careful tenders, of what might happen when people who didn't understand the land's nature tried to impose their will upon it. By the late 1600s, the area had been claimed by English colonizers who were drawn by the valley's natural beauty and the mysterious properties of the lake water, which seemed to have healing qualities they couldn't quite explain but were eager to exploit. The name Silent Hill emerged during this period, though its exact etymology remains debated. Some say it referred to the unusual acoustic properties of the valley, others to the unsettling quiet that would sometimes fall over the area, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The Settlement of Judgment. In the year 1698, a group of religious settlers arrived in the valley, led by a charismatic preacher named Mordecai Toluca, whose interpretation of Christianity blended conventional doctrine with mystical elements that his followers found compelling but church authorities deemed heretical. This group, fleeing persecution in the more established colonies, saw in Silent Hill's isolated valley a chance to create their vision of a godly community, untainted by the compromises and corruptions they perceived in the wider world. The Toluca sect, as historians would later call them, believed in the imminent arrival of paradise on earth, but only after a period of judgment and purification. They interpreted the strange phenomena they occasionally witnessed in the valley: unexplained mists, sounds with no source, shadows that moved independently as signs of divine presence, proof that they had been led to holy ground where the boundary between heaven and earth was thin. The settlement they established was organized around principles of absolute moral purity, with a system of public confession, communal judgment, and harsh punishment for perceived sins. What started as voluntary spiritual discipline gradually transformed into oppressive social control. Children were taught that their every thought was monitored by God, that sin in the heart was equivalent to sin in deed, that suffering was purification. The town's early architecture reflected these beliefs. The church, built at the settlement's center, featured unusual symbols that blended Christian iconography with patterns that seemed drawn from older sources, perhaps unconsciously influenced by lingering indigenous spiritual markers, or possibly emerging from the land itself in response to the settlers' intense focus on judgment and punishment. As the settlement grew, so did reports of strange occurrences. Children spoke of seeing angels in the mist, though their descriptions suggested beings more terrifying than comforting. Adults reported dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions of their sins made manifest in monstrous form. Some colonists fled, speaking of the town as cursed, but those who remained interpreted these experiences as divine trials, tests of faith that would prepare them for the coming paradise. The year 1712 brought the first recorded instance of what would become a recurring pattern in Silent Hill's history, a collective manifestation event. Following the trial and execution of a woman accused of witchcraft, though her only crime seemed to be questioning the sect's increasingly extreme practices, the entire town was enveloped in a thick fog that lasted for 7 days. During this period, multiple witnesses reported seeing impossible things. Streets that led to places they shouldn't, buildings that weren't quite right, and figures in the mist that resembled the accused woman, but transformed into something inhuman. When the fog lifted, several colonists were missing, including the preacher's own daughter. Those who remained were changed, speaking little of what they had experienced, but implementing even stricter moral codes, as if hoping to prevent another such event. The church records from this period, when they can be deciphered at all, suggest a community gripped by collective trauma, interpreting their suffering as necessary spiritual evolution. The Civil War Prison. By the mid-1800s, Silent Hill had evolved from its extreme religious origins into a more conventional town, though one that still carried an unusual atmosphere that visitors often remarked upon. The descendants of the original settlers had mellowed their ancestors' harsh doctrine into a more mainstream Christianity, though certain local traditions and beliefs persisted that outsiders found peculiar. The town had developed a modest economy based on coal mining in the surrounding hills and the early tourism drawn by Toluca Lake's supposedly healing waters. The Gillespie family had emerged as the town's primary landowners and political leaders, their wealth built on coal and their influence extending into every aspect of local governance. They maintained a careful balance between promoting Silent Hill as a health resort and managing the occasional incidents that might damage its reputation. When the Civil War began in 1861, Silent Hill's isolation made it an ideal location for a military prison. The Toluca prison camp, constructed on the shores of the lake, was intended to house Confederate prisoners in what authorities believed would be a secure, remote location. The prison's design incorporated the existing architecture of an old Toluca sect building, including underground chambers that had originally served purposes the sect's records deliberately obscured. The prison's history was brief but horrific. Conditions deteriorated rapidly due to overcrowding, insufficient supplies, and the particularly harsh winter of 1862. But beyond the typical privations of Civil War prisons, something else was happening at Toluca. Guards reported that prisoners were experiencing shared nightmares, speaking of a town that wasn't quite Silent Hill, filled with impossibly long corridors and doors that opened onto nothing. The prison doctor, Matthias Cray, became obsessed with these phenomena, conducting experiments that started as medical observation but evolved into something darker. He theorized that extreme suffering could induce a state of consciousness that allowed perception of other realities. His notes, discovered years later, described attempts to deliberately induce these states through methods that anticipated later psychological torture techniques. The situation culminated in November 1863, with an event the few surviving records refer to only as the November Incident. Over the course of a single night, guards reported that the prison seemed to fold in on itself, with corridors extending impossibly far, cells multiplying, and the screams of prisoners echoing from directions that didn't correspond to the prison's actual layout. By morning, nearly half the prisoners and several guards had vanished entirely, leaving behind only bloodstains in patterns that seemed deliberately arranged but meaningful in ways no one could interpret. The prison was closed immediately, its remaining prisoners transferred, and the incident officially attributed to a revolt that was suppressed with necessary force. But local records tell different stories of things seen in the fog that rolled off the lake that night, of transformations witnessed that the mind refused to properly process, of guilt and suffering given physical form. The abandoned prison structures were eventually demolished, but the underground chambers were simply sealed. The land was declared unsuitable for development and left to return to nature, though locals noticed that vegetation grew strangely there and animals avoided the area entirely. The Great Dying. The year 871 brought a catastrophe that would fundamentally alter Silent Hill's relationship with death and the supernatural. An epidemic, it's exact. Nature still debated by historians, with symptoms that didn't quite match any known disease swept through the town with devastating efficiency. Within 3 months, nearly half the population had died, with children being particularly susceptible. The disease presented not just physical symptoms, but psychological ones. The afflicted reported vivid hallucinations, shared visions of a dark realm that existed parallel to Silent Hill, and encounters with deceased relatives who spoke of judgment and unfinished business. Medical professionals from outside the town, brought in to help combat the epidemic, fled after experiencing what they described as medical impossibilities, patients whose symptoms changed based on their guilt, wounds that formed symbols, fever dreams that multiple patients experienced simultaneously. The town's response to the epidemic revealed deep divisions that had been papered over by prosperity. The wealthy Gillespie family and their associates retreated to estates outside the immediate town, implementing quarantine procedures that saved their lives but destroyed their moral authority. The working-class population, particularly the miners, were left to fend for themselves, developing their own understanding of what was happening based on folklore and half-remembered indigenous warnings. It was during this period that the order first emerged as an organized force. This religious movement, drawing on the old Toluca sect's beliefs but incorporating elements of spiritualism, indigenous mythology, and apocalyptic Christianity, provided explanation and structure for a population desperate for meaning in their suffering. The order taught that the epidemic was a cleansing, that Silent Hill had been chosen as the site where paradise would be born from humanity's pain. The epidemic ended as mysteriously as it began, with the last cases reported in December 1871. But Silent Hill was transformed. The mass graves on the edge of town, the orphaned children, the empty houses, these physical reminders were accompanied by psychological and spiritual changes. Survivors reported that the town felt different, that shadows fell in ways that didn't quite match the sun's position, that sometimes they would turn a corner and briefly see streets filled with bodies before blinking and finding them normal again. The order grew in influence during the recovery period, offering comfort to the bereaved and explanation for the inexplicable. They established orphanages for children who had lost their parents, though these institutions would later be remembered more for their harsh discipline and strange teachings than for any kindness. The order's theology evolved to incorporate the epidemic as a crucial event in their salvation mythology, the Great Dying, that prepared the ground for Paradise's eventual arrival. The resort era, by the 1890s, Silent Hill had reinvented itself as a tourist destination, marketing the healing waters of Toluca Lake and the refreshing mountain air to wealthy urbanites seeking respite from industrial cities. The Lakeview Hotel, constructed in 1898, became the crown jewel of this transformation, an elegant establishment that hosted notable figures from politics, industry, and the arts. This period of prosperity was carefully managed to present Silent Hill as a place of restoration and peace, while systematically suppressing any mention of its stranger histories. The Gillespie family, having survived the epidemic, led this transformation, understanding that the town's economic survival depended on controlling its narrative. The Silent Hill Historical Society was established in 1891, ostensibly to preserve the town's heritage, but actually to manage what stories were told and which were buried. Documents relating to the prison camp, the epidemic, and the original Toluca sect were restricted or destroyed. A sanitized history was constructed that emphasized pioneer courage and natural beauty, while omitting darkness and anomaly. Yet the town's fundamental nature couldn't be entirely suppressed. Guests at the resort hotels occasionally reported unusual experiences, rooms that seemed different at night than during the day, reflections in the lake that didn't quite match reality, dreams influenced by places they'd never been and people they'd never met. Most dismissed these as quirks of altitude or the effects of mineral springs, but some visitors left early, unsettled by something they couldn't quite articulate. The resort era also saw the development of Silent Hill's distinctive architecture, a style that seemed to unconsciously incorporate patterns and proportions that reflected the town's hidden nature. Buildings were constructed with hallways that didn't quite make geometric sense. Windows that looked out on views that shouldn't be visible from their positions. Basements that seemed more extensive than their buildings' footprints should allow. During this period, the order operated quietly, maintaining their orphanages and conducting their rituals in private while publicly presenting themselves as simply another Christian denomination. They had learned from the Toluca sect's fate that overt extremism invited suppression, so they integrated themselves into the town's legitimate power structures. Members served on the town council, ran businesses, taught in schools. The children raised in order orphanages during this era would later form the core of the movement's most devoted followers. Taught from childhood that suffering was sacred, that Silent Hill was chosen ground, that paradise awaited those who could endure judgment. These individuals carried trauma disguised as faith into the 20th century. The coal mine disaster, February 17, 1911, marked another pivotal moment in Silent Hill's accumulation of tragedy. The Gillespie coal mine, the town's economic backbone alongside tourism, experienced a catastrophic collapse that trapped 47 miners underground. The rescue efforts that followed revealed more about Silent Hill's nature than anyone was prepared to confront. Initial rescue attempts proceeded normally, with teams working to clear debris and establish contact with potential survivors. But after 3 days, rescue workers began reporting anomalies. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Passages that had been cleared would be found sealed again. Most disturbing were the sounds from below, not just the expected settling of rock, but voices, too many voices, including some that family members swore belonged to miners who had died years before. On the 5th day, a rescue team led by Thomas Gillespie, son of the mine's owner, descended into a partially cleared shaft and didn't return for 14 hours. When they emerged, they were physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered. Thomas reported that they had found themselves not in mine tunnels, but in a vast underground complex that couldn't possibly exist, filled with industrial machinery that seemed both ancient and futuristic, operated by figures that might have been the missing miners but were somehow wrong. The official rescue efforts were called off after a week, with all 47 miners declared dead. But families reported seeing their lost relatives in the fog that periodically rolled through town, unchanged by time, beckoning them toward the sealed mine entrance. Children playing near the mine claimed to hear their fathers calling from below, promising they would come home soon if only someone would let them out. The Gillespie family sealed the mine permanently, using dynamite to collapse the main entrance and posting guards to prevent anyone from attempting to dig through. They provided generous compensation to the families of the deceased, with the implicit understanding that no questions would be asked about what had really happened underground. But the mine disaster's effects rippled through Silent Hill's collective unconscious. The Order incorporated it into their theology as another necessary sacrifice, another step toward paradise. The sealed mine became a focal point for local folklore, with stories of parallel towns existing underground, of miners who had found something in the depths that had transformed them beyond human recognition. The economic impact forced Silent Hill to rely even more heavily on tourism, but the town's reputation had begun to shift. It was no longer just a resort, but a place where strange things happened, attracting a different kind of visitor occultists, spiritualists, those seeking encounters with the supernatural rather than simple rest and relaxation. The Wish House. In 1918, as the world reeled from the Great War and the Spanish flu pandemic, Silent Hill experienced its own localized tragedy that would have lasting consequences. The Wish House, an orphanage run by the Order under the official name of St. Jerome's Children's Home, became the site of events that even the Order found difficult to incorporate into their theology. The orphanage housed children who had lost parents to war, disease, or the various tragedies that seemed to accumulate around Silent Hill with unusual frequency. The matron, Dahlia Gillespie, a descendant of the founding family who had embraced the Order's beliefs with fervor that concerned even other members, implemented a regime that blended religious instruction with practices drawn from sources the Order's official doctrine didn't acknowledge. Children at the Wish House were taught that their suffering had purpose, that their pain was preparing them for a special role in the coming paradise. They were subjected to rituals of purification that included extended isolation, fasting, and exposure to what Dahlia called holy visions, but which survivors would later describe as induced hallucinations of their worst fears made manifest. The orphanage's nickname came from a ritual Dahlia instituted, where children could make wishes by offering their own blood to a presence that inhabited the building's sub-basement. Children reported that wishes made this way would come true, but in twisted forms that taught harsh lessons about the danger of desire. A child who wished for parents might see manifestations of their dead mother and father that would reveal horrible truths. A child who wished to leave would find themselves lost in corridors that extended impossibly through space, returning only when they begged to stay. In November 1918, something went catastrophically wrong with one of Dahlia's rituals. 17 children died in a single night, their bodies found arranged in a pattern throughout the orphanage that suggested they had participated willingly in whatever had killed them. The surviving children were unable or unwilling to explain what had happened, speaking only of a door that had opened, of something that had been invited in, of promises made that couldn't be unmade. The official investigation attributed the deaths to Spanish flu, though the symptoms didn't match and all 17 children had died at approximately the same moment. The Wish House was temporarily closed, then reopened under new management that maintained a facade of normal orphanage operations, while continuing the order's practices in more subtle forms. The building itself seemed changed by what had happened. Staff reported that the orphanage's layout would occasionally shift, that rooms would appear and disappear, that children would sometimes be found in parts of the building that had been sealed for years. The sub-basement, where Dahlia had conducted her most extreme rituals, was bricked up, but maintenance workers reported hearing sounds from behind the wall. Children singing hymns that the order had never taught, in voices that didn't sound entirely human. Alessa Gillespie's Birth and Burning. The 1960s brought a period of relative quiet to Silent Hill, as if the town were catching its breath before the next act of its dark drama. The resort industry had declined but not disappeared. The coal industry had never recovered from the 1911 disaster, and the town sustained itself through a combination of modest tourism, light manufacturing, and the kind of economic stagnation that keeps places alive but not thriving. Into this environment, on November 4, 1961, Alessa Gillespie was born to Dahlia Gillespie, the same woman who had overseen the Wish House tragedy decades earlier. Dahlia had spent the intervening years deepening her involvement with the order, rising to a position of significant influence despite, or perhaps because of, her extremist interpretations of their doctrine. Alessa's father was never publicly identified, leading to speculation and rumor that followed the child throughout her early years. Some whispered that Dahlia had conceived through ritual means, that Alessa's father was not human in any conventional sense. Others suggested more mundane but equally scandalous possibilities. Dahlia herself would only say that Alessa was chosen before birth for a special purpose. From infancy, Alessa displayed unusual characteristics. She seemed to know things she shouldn't, would react to people based on secrets they thought hidden, could occasionally make objects move without touching them. These abilities, rather than being nurtured or helped, made her a target. Other children feared her, adults whispered about her, and even the order members who should have recognized her gifts as divine manifestation seemed unsettled by her presence. Dahlia raised Alessa with a combination of religious fervor and calculated cruelty, believing that suffering would strengthen her daughter's spiritual power. Alessa was subjected to rituals of purification, forced to participate in order ceremonies that even adult members found disturbing, and isolated from any influence that might dilute her purpose as Dahlia understood it. The situation deteriorated as Alessa grew older, and her abilities became stronger and less controlled. Objects would spontaneously combust when she was angry. Shadows would move independently when she was frightened. And, most disturbing, other people would occasionally experience her emotions as physical sensations, her fear becoming their terror, her pain manifesting as wounds on their bodies. On November 15, 1969, when Alessa was barely 8 years old, Dahlia attempted a ritual that would change Silent Hill forever. Believing that Alessa was destined to birth the Order's god, an entity they called Samael, or simply God, which would transform the world into paradise through judgment and purification. Dahlia performed what she called the ritual of the Holy Assumption. The ritual involved fire, based on the Order's belief that burning was the ultimate purification. But something went wrong, or perhaps right, depending on perspective. The flames that were supposed to transform Alessa into a vessel for God instead split her soul, creating a division between her physical body, horrifically burned but kept alive through means that defied medical understanding, and other aspects of her being that dispersed into Silent Hill itself. The official record stated that a boiler explosion in the Gillespie house had caused the tragedy. Alessa was rushed to Alchemilla Hospital, where she remained in a state that doctors couldn't properly classify, not quite alive, not properly dead, existing in some liminal space that medical science had no framework to understand. Dahlia insisted on specific, unusual treatments that the hospital administration, many of whom were Order members, allowed despite their questionable medical value. The fog world's manifestation. In the years following Alessa's burning, Silent Hill began experiencing phenomena that even its unusual history hadn't prepared it for. The fog that had always periodically rolled in from Toluca Lake became more frequent, lasting longer, carrying within it something more than moisture. People caught in these fogs reported momentary transportation to another Silent Hill, one where the buildings were right but everything else was wrong. This fog world, as locals began calling it, seemed to be a reflection of Silent Hill filtered through profound sadness and isolation. Streets were empty of people but filled with the suggestion of presence. Sounds echoed from nowhere: footsteps, breathing, children crying. The geometry of space became unreliable, with distances stretching or contracting based on no physical law. Most disturbing were the creatures that began appearing in the fog world. Not quite human, not entirely animal, these beings seemed constructed from symbolism rather than biology. A nurse with no face but too many legs, moving in ways that suggested seduction and revulsion simultaneously. Dogs with split heads that moved in coordinated packs despite their impossible anatomy. Figures wrapped in straitjackets that moved by writhing across the ground. Moaning sounds that might be pain or pleasure. Those who encountered these beings and survived reported that the creatures seemed drawn from their own minds, their own fears and shames given form. A person with medical trauma might see corrupted nurses and doctors. Someone with religious guilt might encounter angelic figures whose beauty had curdled into something obscene. The fog world was revealing itself to be not just another dimension, but a psychological space made manifest. The barrier between normal Silent Hill and the fog world was permeable and unpredictable. Sometimes a person would walk through a door and find themselves in that other place. Sometimes the transition was gradual, the normal world slowly becoming wrong, until the person realized they were no longer where they started. and sometimes, increasingly, elements of the fog world would bleed through into normal reality. A creature glimpsed in peripheral vision, a sound with no source, a shadow that moved against the light. The Order interpreted these developments as signs that their prophecies were being fulfilled, that Alessa's transformation had begun the process of Paradise's arrival. They conducted rituals designed to thin the barriers further, believing that the complete merger of the worlds would herald their god's birth. Other residents, those not inducted into the Order's beliefs, experienced growing terror as their town became increasingly unstable. During this period, a young doctor named Michael Kaufman arrived at Alchemilla Hospital. Ambitious and morally flexible, Kaufman quickly recognized that Silent Hill offered opportunities for someone willing to embrace, rather than flee from, its strangeness. He began documenting the medical anomalies he encountered, developing theories about the relationship between psychological states and physical manifestation that would have been dismissed as fantasy anywhere else, but seemed demonstrable fact in Silent Hill. Kaufmann's research led him to Alessa, still suspended in her impossible state in a secret wing of the hospital. He began experimenting with a drug he developed from local plants that grew only in areas where the barrier between worlds was thinnest. This substance, which he called PTV, though its exact composition remained his secret, could induce states where users could consciously navigate between the normal world and the fog world. Harry Mason's arrival. In 1983, a writer named Harry Mason and his wife found an infant abandoned on the side of a highway outside Silent Hill. The baby, who they would name Cheryl, exhibited no signs of abuse or neglect, appearing healthy despite her mysterious origins. Unable to have children of their own, the Masons saw her discovery as a miracle and quickly moved to adopt her. What Harry didn't know was that Cheryl was no ordinary abandoned child. She was the other half of Alessa Gillespie's split soul, the innocent aspect that had escaped Dahlia's ritual and manifested as a separate being. Drawn by forces she didn't understand, Cheryl would occasionally speak of a town she'd never visited, draw pictures of places she'd never seen, and wake from nightmares calling for a sister she didn't have. As Cheryl grew, her connection to Silent Hill and Alessa strengthened. She would have episodes where she seemed to be in two places at once, experiencing sensations from a body that wasn't hers, feeling pain from burns she'd never suffered. Harry, devoted to his daughter but unable to explain these incidents, consulted numerous specialists who could offer no medical explanation for Cheryl's symptoms. When Cheryl was 7 years old, the same age Alessa had been when she was burned, the compulsion to return to Silent Hill became overwhelming. She began sleepwalking, always heading in the same direction, sometimes making it miles from home before Harry found her. She drew the same image obsessively, a town shrouded in fog, with a lake reflecting not the sky but something darker. Harry's wife died when Cheryl was very young, leaving him to raise her alone. This loss bonded them even closer, with Harry becoming fiercely protective of his daughter while trying to understand her mysterious condition. He researched the area where they'd found her, discovering references to Silent Hill that seemed to match Cheryl's descriptions and drawings. Finally, in the summer of 1990, when Cheryl was 7, Harry decided to take her to Silent Hill, hoping that visiting the place she seemed to dream about might provide answers or relief. They drove through the mountains, Cheryl growing simultaneously more excited and more anxious as they approached. She spoke of feeling like she was going home, though she'd never been there before. As they descended the winding road into Silent Hill, fog began to gather with unnatural speed. Harry, struggling to see through the increasingly dense mist, didn't notice the figure in the road until it was too late to stop entirely. He swerved, the car skidding off the road and crashing into a barrier. When he awakened, Cheryl was gone, and the fog had transformed into something more than whether it had become a doorway into the other world that Silent Hill had been gestating for decades. The search for Cheryl Harry Mason awakened to find himself in a Silent Hill that bore only superficial resemblance to the resort town described in travel guides. The fog was so thick that visibility extended only a few feet, and the silence was absolute, except for the sound of his own footsteps and breathing. The car was empty, its door open as if Cheryl had simply walked away, though there were no footprints in the ash that seemed to fall like snow from the gray sky. Following what he thought might be Cheryl's voice calling for him, Harry entered the town proper, finding streets empty of people but filled with the detritus of lives' interrupted cars, abandoned with engines still running, shops open but unattended, meals half-eaten on restaurant tables. The farther he walked, the more wrong everything became, until he found himself in an alley that shouldn't have existed, pursuing a figure that might have been Cheryl but moved in ways that suggested something else entirely. The alley darkened despite it being midday. The walls began to rust and decay as if aging decades in seconds, and Harry found himself surrounded by creatures that defied rational explanation. Small, gray beings that moved like children but had no faces, only scarred flesh where features should have been. They overwhelmed him, and he collapsed, certain he was dying, only to awaken in a diner that seemed almost normal except for the woman studying a map with intense concentration. Sybil Bennett, a police officer from the neighboring town of Brahms, had come to Silent Hill to investigate the loss of communication with the town. She found Harry's story of monsters and transformed alleys difficult to believe. But she couldn't deny that something was catastrophically wrong with Silent Hill. They agreed to search for Cheryl together, though the town seemed determined to separate them, with doors that would open for one but not the other, paths that led to different destinations depending on who walked them. Harry's search led him to Alchemilla Hospital, where the line between the fog world and something worse became increasingly blurred. The hospital's halls were populated by nurses whose heads twitched at impossible angles, whose bodies moved with a sexuality that was somehow more disturbing than their deformities. These creatures, Harry would later understand, were manifestations of Alessa's complicated relationship with the medical staff who had kept her in a state of living death for years, caregivers who were also tormentors, healers who prolonged suffering. In the hospital's otherworld version, a place of rust and blood, where the walls pulsed like living tissue and the air tasted of metal, Harry encountered Lisa Garland, a nurse who seemed human, seemed helpful, but something about her presence felt wrong in ways Harry couldn't articulate. She spoke of caring for a patient who had been there for years, a girl who shouldn't still be alive, but her memories were fragmented, confused, as if she were remembering someone else's life. The Otherworld's Nature. As Harry delved deeper into Silent Hill's mysteries, he began to understand that the town existed in multiple states simultaneously. The normal world, which few could access anymore, was the Silent Hill of maps and memories. The fog world was a gray reflection, sad and empty, but not actively malevolent. But there was a third state, the Otherworld, that was something else entirely. The Otherworld appeared to be Alessa's pain and rage made manifest, a dimension where the very architecture expressed trauma. Floors were metal grating over bottomless darkness. Walls were chain-link fence or rusted metal that bled without source, and the air itself carried the smell of burning flesh. This wasn't just another version of Silent Hill. It was a psychological landscape given physical form, a place where symbolism had replaced physics as the organizing principle. The transitions between worlds followed no predictable pattern that Harry could discern. Sometimes a siren would sound air raid warnings that Silent Hill had never actually used, and reality would peel away like old paint. Sometimes he would simply walk through a door and find himself in a different world. And sometimes, most disturbingly, elements of one world would appear in another, as if the boundaries were not just permeable but breaking down entirely. Harry discovered documents that suggested the Order had been trying to control or at least predict these transitions for years. Their symbol, the halo of the sun, appeared throughout the town in contexts that suggested it was more than decoration. It seemed to mark places where the worlds were particularly thin, where crossing over was more likely. The Order's churches and ritual sites were built on these locations, their architecture incorporating geometries that didn't quite make sense in three-dimensional space. The creatures inhabiting each world were different. The fog world's beings seemed lost, confused, dangerous but not deliberately cruel. The other world's monsters were expressions of specific traumas Alessa's, but also those of anyone with strong emotional connections to the town. Harry began to realize that his own fears and guilt were shaping what he encountered. The monsters weren't just obstacles. They were communications from the unconscious made horrifyingly tangible. Dahlia Gillespie appeared to Harry during this period, though appeared might not be the right word. She seemed to exist partially in multiple worlds simultaneously, her form shifting depending on which reality was dominant. She spoke in riddles and religious metaphor, guiding Harry toward churches and ritual sites while hiding her true intentions. She gave him an object called the Floros, a pyramidal artifact that she claimed would help him find Cheryl, but actually served her own purposes. The truth of Alessa and Cheryl? Through documents found in the Otherworld version of Alchemilla Hospital, encounters with the spectral Lisa Garland, and Dahlia's manipulative guidance, Harry began to piece together the truth. Cheryl wasn't just a girl who happened to resemble someone from Silent Hill. She was literally part of Alessa Gillespie, the portion of her soul that had escaped the ritual burning and manifested as a separate person. Alessa had used what power remained to her to prevent her mother from completing the ritual that would birth the Order's god. By splitting herself, sending part of her soul away as baby Cheryl, she had made it impossible for the god to be born, as it required a complete vessel. For 7 years this standoff had continued, Dahlia keeping Alessa's burned body alive, but unable to complete the ritual. Alessa using her connection to Silent Hill's spiritual properties to create the other world as both prison and fortress. But Cheryl's return to Silent Hill had upset this balance. The two halves of Alessa's soul were drawn to each other with a force that neither could resist. Cheryl had disappeared from the car because she'd been pulled back to Alessa, beginning a reunification that would either complete Dahlia's ritual or potentially end it forever. Harry found Alessa's body in a hidden room in the hospital, suspended in a state that shouldn't have been survivable, burned beyond recognition but somehow conscious, somehow maintaining the enormous psychic effort required to keep the other world manifested. The flauros that Dahlia had given him proved to be a trap, temporarily disrupting Alessa's power and allowing Dahlia to capture her. The confrontation moved to the amusement park on the lake's edge, a place that in the other world had become a nightmarish carnival of Alessa's few happy memories twisted into mockeries. Here, Dahlia attempted to force the final merger of Alessa and Cheryl, to birth her god through the reunified vessel. But Alessa had one more strategy she used the moment of reunification, not to become Dahlia's tool, but to transform into something else entirely. The being that emerged from the merger of Alessa and Cheryl was neither child nor adult, neither human nor divine. It was Alessa's rage given form, her pain transformed into power, her years of suffering crystallized into a moment of absolute judgment. This incubator, as Dahlia called it in her final moments, turned on its would-be controller, killing Dahlia with the very flames she had used to burn, Alessa 7 years before. The god's birth and defeat. But Dahlia's death came too late to prevent what she had set in motion. The merger of Alessa and Cheryl, combined with years of ritual preparation and the spiritual energy accumulated through suffering, had indeed created the conditions for the Order's god to manifest. This entity, which the Order called Samael, but which seemed to have no true name in any human language, began to gestate within the incubator that Alessa had become. The god that began to emerge was not the paradise bringer the Order had imagined, but something far more alien and terrible. It was judgment without mercy, power without wisdom, divinity filtered through human trauma until it became cosmic horror. Harry could see it taking shape wings that were also wounds, eyes that were also mouths, a form that hurt to perceive because it existed in more dimensions than human vision could process. Michael Kaufman, who had been manipulating events from the shadows, revealed himself at this crucial moment. He had been using Dahlia as much as she thought she was using him, planning to control the god through a combination of the PTV drug he'd developed and arcane knowledge he'd acquired through years of study. But his plans, like Dahlia's, had failed to account for Alessa's will. In a final act of agency, Alessa used Kaufman's own weapon against the god, a sample of Aglau foetus, a substance derived from a plant that could only grow in places where the boundary between worlds was thin. When introduced into the god's gestating form, it caused a violent separation, expelling the deity from its host in an incomplete, vulnerable state. Harry fought this premature god in a battle that took place simultaneously across multiple dimensions. In the fog world, he fired bullets that seemed pathetically inadequate. In the other world, those same bullets carried the weight of his determination to save his daughter. In the spaces between worlds, where symbolism mattered more than physics, his paternal love became a weapon as real as any gun. The god's defeat caused a cascade failure throughout Silent Hill's overlapping realities. The other world began to collapse, its architecture folding in on itself as the psychic energy that sustained it dissipated. The fog world started to bleed back into normal reality, creating hybrid spaces that couldn't exist for long. The entire town shuddered as if waking from a nightmare, though what it was waking into wasn't necessarily better. In the final moments before complete collapse, Alessa, or what remained of her after everything she had endured, performed one last act of mercy. She manifested a baby, a reincarnation of herself free from the trauma and suffering that had defined her existence. She gave this child to Harry, a replacement for the daughter he had lost when Cheryl merged back with Alessa. It was simultaneously a gift, an apology, and a hope for redemption. The aftermath, and James Sunderland Harry escaped Silent Hill with the infant he would name Heather, fleeing as the town retreated into an exhausted quiet. The other world had collapsed, but its influence had permanently altered Silent Hill. The town that remained was neither the resort of old nor the nightmare Harry had experienced, but something between a place where reality remained thin, where the right psychological conditions could still cause the fog to roll in with more than moisture in its embrace. In the years that followed Harry's escape, Silent Hill developed a different kind of reputation. It wasn't just abandoned, plenty of towns were abandoned. It was abandoned in a way that suggested something was still there, waiting. The roads leading to it were gradually removed from maps, not through conspiracy but through a collective, unconscious agreement that some places were better forgotten. But Silent Hill's influence didn't respect geographical boundaries. Those who had been touched by it carried something back with them into the normal world. They reported dreams of fog-shrouded streets, of doors that opened onto impossible corridors, of shadows that moved independently of their sources. Some returned to Silent Hill, drawn by compulsions they couldn't explain. Most were never seen again. 3 years after Harry's experience, a man named James Sunderland received a letter that should have been impossible. It was from his wife Mary, who had died 3 years earlier from a terminal illness. The letter asked him to meet her in Silent Hill, in their special place, though it didn't specify where that was. James knew the letter couldn't be real. He had watched Mary die, had been with her through the final stages of her illness, but the combination of grief and desperate hope drove him to make the journey. The Silent Hill that James entered was different from what Harry had experienced. While Harry's journey had been shaped by Alessa's trauma and the Order's mythology, James's Silent Hill was crafted from his own psychology. The fog was thicker, more oppressive, carrying within it the weight of unacknowledged guilt. The monsters he encountered were manifestations of his own psyche nurses that reflected his conflicted feelings about Mary's hospitalization. Abstract forms that suggested sexual frustration and violence, pyramid-headed executioners that embodied his desire for punishment. James's journey through Silent Hill revealed the truth he had been hiding from himself. He had killed Mary. Not 3 years ago, as he believed, but much more recently. The terminal illness had been real, but in the final days, unable to bear watching her suffer and unable to bear his own suffering as caretaker, he had smothered her with a pillow. His mind, unable to process this act, had created false memories, extending the time since her death to make it bearable. The personal hells. What James's experience revealed was that Silent Hill had evolved, or perhaps had always been capable of creating, personalized purgatories for those who entered it. The town read the psychology of its visitors and reflected their inner worlds back at them in the form of physical spaces and entities. It had become a kind of psychological processor, forcing confrontation with repressed truths through symbolism made manifest. During his journey, James encountered others drawn to Silent Hill by their own psychological needs. Angela Orozco, a young woman who had killed her abusive father, experienced Silent Hill as a place of constant fire everywhere she went, eventually burst into flames that only she could feel, reflecting both her trauma and her belief that she deserved to burn. Her monsters were abstract representations of aggression and violation, doorways that became mouths, walls that suggested flesh. Eddie Dombrowski, who had fled to Silent Hill after shooting a dog and wounding its owner, found a town filled with mockery and judgment. His Silent Hill was populated by representations of everyone who had ever laughed at him for his weight, his perceived weakness, his failure to meet social expectations. The refrigerated areas he gravitated toward weren't just cold, but emotionally frozen, spaces where he could act out violence without feeling. Laura, a child who had known Mary from the hospital, experienced almost none of Silent Hill's horror. Having no deep guilt or trauma for the town to reflect, she saw it as merely abandoned and foggy. She could walk through spaces that were nightmarish for James without seeing anything wrong. Her presence suggested that Silent Hill's manifestations were entirely subjective, that the town itself was neutral, merely revealing what was already within those who entered it. Maria, James's most complex encounter, was something unprecedented, a creation of Silent Hill itself, or perhaps of James's psyche interacting with the town's properties. She looked almost exactly like Mary, but dressed more provocatively, acted more sexually aggressive, represented everything Mary couldn't be during her illness. She seemed real, had memories and personality, but would die and resurrect repeatedly, each death forcing James to relive the loss of Mary, each resurrection offering the false hope of redemption. The pyramid-head creatures that pursued James throughout his journey were particularly significant. These beings, with their massive triangular helmets and executioner's bearing, weren't external threats, but projections of James's desire for punishment. They were his guilt made manifest, judges and executioners that he had unconsciously summoned to deliver the justice he felt he deserved. The nature of judgment. As James descended deeper into his personalized hell, the nature of Silent Hill's judgment became clearer. The town wasn't punishing people in any traditional sense. It was forcing them to punish themselves, to confront truths they had buried, to experience physically what they had been experiencing psychologically all along. Was therapy through horror, revelation through symbol, truth through transformation. The locations James visited were simultaneously real places in Silent Hill and constructions of his psyche. The hospital, where he confronted medical trauma, the historical society where he descended into the past, the prison where he faced judgment, the hotel where he finally remembered the truth. Each location existed on multiple levels of meaning. They were architectural spaces, psychological states, and spiritual trials all at once. James's final confrontation wasn't with an external god or demon, but with himself literally, in some endings, where he fought a manifestation of himself transformed by guilt into something monstrous. The multiple possible endings to his journey suggested that Silent Hill didn't determine fate, but revealed character. Depending on how James behaved throughout his ordeal, he might find redemption, repeat his sins, achieve a kind of peace, or descend into delusion. One ending had him leaving Silent Hill with Laura, adopting her as Mary had wanted, finding redemption through taking responsibility for another life. Another had him driving into Toluca Lake, following Mary into death, unable to live with what he had done. Yet another suggested he might resurrect Mary through occult means, having learned nothing, doomed to repeat cycles of guilt and violence. The most enigmatic ending involved the discovery of items suggesting that everything experienced might have been the delusion of a dog operating controls. A surreal conclusion that might have been Silent Hill's way of suggesting that the search for meaning in suffering was itself potentially absurd, that sometimes trauma and guilt created elaborate narratives that had no more inherent meaning than random chance. Heather's return. 17 years after Harry Mason escaped Silent Hill with the reincarnated Alessa Cheryl, the past reasserted itself. Heather Mason, as Harry had named her, had grown up with no memory of her previous existence, living a relatively normal life despite Harry's protective vigilance, and their frequent relocations to stay ahead of anyone who might be searching for them. The Order had never stopped looking for Alessa. Though weakened by Dahlia's death and the failure of their god's birth, they had reorganized under a new leader, Claudia Wolfe, who had grown up with Alessa in the Order's orphanages, and believed that completing the ritual was the only way to create the paradise that would justify all their suffering. Claudia located Heather through patient investigation and the assistance of Vincent Smith, a priest who played all sides while pursuing his own agenda. She orchestrated a series of events designed to awaken Heather's dormant memories, to transform her back into Alessa so that she could birth the god that had failed to fully manifest 17 years earlier. The catalyst was Harry's murder, killed by a monster called the Missionary under Claudia's orders. This traumatic event began Heather's transformation, triggering memories of her past life and drawing her back to Silent Hill. But Heather was not the same person as Alessa or Cheryl. She had 17 years of different experiences. A father's love that Alessa had never known, and a strength born from being raised by someone who understood Silent Hill's dangers. Heather's journey through Silent Hill was different from both Harry's and James's experiences. She encountered the Order's manufactured hell, a version of the otherworld deliberately maintained through ritual and suffering, rather than spontaneously manifested through trauma. The Order had learned to partially control Silent Hill's properties, creating stable pockets of nightmare that they used for initiation and punishment. The monsters Heather faced were partly Alessa's old fears made manifest again, but filtered through Heather's modern sensibilities. The nurses were more mechanical, industrial, reflecting a contemporary fear of dehumanized medicine. The closer creatures, massive beings with enlarged heads and arms, suggested the overwhelming nature of destiny closing in. The slurper monsters, crawling forms that emerged from pools of blood, represented the past trying to drag her back. The second god. As Heather progressed through Silent Hill, the god gestating within her grew stronger. This wasn't the same entity that had tried to emerge 17 years ago. It had been influenced by Heather's different experiences, by the additional years of preparation, by the Order's refined rituals. It was potentially more powerful, but also more vulnerable to Heather's will. Vincent Smith revealed that the Order was not united in its goals. Some, like Claudia, were true believers who thought paradise was worth any cost. Others, like Vincent, were opportunists who used the Order's resources for personal gain. Still others were trapped by circumstances, born into the Order's orphanages and knowing no other life. This division weakened them, but also made them unpredictable. Leonard Wolfe, Claudia's father, had become something barely human through years of fanatical devotion and exposure to Silent Hill's transformative properties. He existed in a flooded hospital basement, transformed into an aquatic monster that still clutched the seal of Metatron, an artifact he believed could control God. His battle with Heather was both physical and philosophical, a confrontation between different interpretations of the Order's doctrine. Heather discovered that Harry had prepared for this possibility, leaving her tools and knowledge accumulated through 17 years of research. He had developed his own understanding of Silent Hill's properties, ways to navigate its shifting realities, and, most importantly, a sample of Aglaophotis that Heather could use to expel the god before it fully formed. The confrontation with Claudia occurred in the Order's church, a structure that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Here, Claudia revealed the depth of her belief she genuinely thought that paradise was achievable, that all the suffering would be justified when God transformed the world into a place without pain. Her faith was both admirable and terrifying, absolutely sincere and absolutely destructive. Heather's solution was elegant in its brutality. She swallowed the Aglaophotis and vomited out the god in its fetal form, denying it the chance to fully develop. But Claudia, in a final act of desperate faith, swallowed the expelled fetus herself, attempting to become the god's vessel. The transformation killed her almost instantly, her body unable to contain what Alessa Heather's unique nature had barely managed. The god that emerged from Claudia was incomplete, malformed, a thing of exposed muscle and religious symbolism that had no real power beyond physical violence. Heather defeated it through conventional means, bullets, and determination rather than cosmic confrontation. It was almost anticlimactic, suggesting that the Order's God had only ever been as powerful as the suffering that created it. The Room, and Walter Sullivan. Silent Hill's influence wasn't confined to the town itself. In the city of Ashfield, in an apartment building called South Ashfield Heights, Room 302 became a focal point for a different kind of manifestation. Henry Townshend, a photographer with no connection to Silent Hill or the Order, found himself trapped in his apartment by chains that appeared overnight across his door, chains that no one else could see. This imprisonment was the work of Walter Sullivan, a serial killer who had been executed years earlier, but whose consciousness persisted through a combination of the Order's rituals and his own psychological fracturing. Walter had been raised in the Wish House orphanage, where he had developed the delusion that Room 302 itself was his mother, that it had abandoned him as an infant, and that he could resurrect it through a ritual requiring 21 murders. Walter's version of the other world was different from what manifested in Silent Hill proper. It took the form of parallel versions of locations connected to his victims, each twisted to reflect his understanding of the world, a world where abandonment was the original sin, where mother love was the only salvation, where violence was a form of communication with the divine. Henry's apartment became a hub between worlds, with holes appearing in his bathroom that led to these parallel spaces. Each journey through these holes brought Henry closer to understanding Walter's history and motivation, while also drawing him deeper into the killer's ritual. The apartment itself began to change, with hauntings that started subtle items moving, sounds from empty rooms, and escalated to full manifestations of Walter's victims. The most disturbing aspect was how the apartment began to feel less like a prison and more like a womb. Walter's delusion that room 302 was his mother had begun to reshape reality. The walls breathed, the windows showed views of places that didn't exist. And gradually, Henry began to understand that he wasn't just trapped, he was being prepared for something. Walter had split himself into two personas through the Order's rituals. The adult Walter, who had committed the murders and been executed, and a child, Walter, who existed in the other world, innocent of his older self's crimes. This split allowed him to be both victim and victimizer, both the abandoned child seeking his mother and the killer, creating the conditions for reunion. The 21 Sacraments. Walter's ritual, the 21 Sacraments, was based on a corrupted interpretation of order theology combined with his own psychological needs. Each murder was associated with a specific concept: temptation, source, watchfulness, darkness, that related to Walter's understanding of mother-child relationships and abandonment. The first 10 murders had been committed before Walter's execution, earning him his reputation as a serial killer. But death hadn't stopped him. Through the Order's teachings about consciousness persisting after death, teachings proven true by Alessa's continued existence after her burning, Walter had found ways to continue his work from beyond. The second set of murders occurred in the spaces between worlds, killing people in ways that left their bodies intact but removed something essential. These victims became ghosts haunting the locations of their deaths, trapped in loops of their final moments, serving as anchors for Walter's expanding influence. Henry discovered that he was intended to be the 21st victim, the final sacrament called Receiver of Wisdom. His death would complete the ritual and theoretically resurrect room 302 as Walter's mother. But Henry also found an ally in Eileen Galvin, his neighbor who had survived being designated as the 20th victim, mother, though she bore wounds that wouldn't heal and seemed to be slowly transforming into something else. The child, Walter, in the other world, was the key to stopping the ritual. This innocent aspect of Walter didn't understand what his adult self was doing, knew only that he was scared and wanted his mother. By showing the child, Walter, the truth that room 302 was just a room, that his real mother had been a human being who had abandoned him for human reasons, Henry could potentially break the delusion holding the ritual together. The final confrontation took place in a space that was simultaneously room 302, Walter's imagined mother's womb, and a manifestation of the killer's psyche. Adult Walter had to be fought physically while child Walter had to be saved spiritually. The umbilical cord that Walter believed connected him to room 302 had to be severed, literally and symbolically, to end the ritual. The cult's evolution. Following the defeats experienced through Harry, James, and Heather's interventions, the Order underwent fundamental changes. The old guard, who had believed in paradise through divine birth, were largely dead or disillusioned. A new generation arose with different interpretations of Silent Hill's powers and their potential applications. This new order was less focused on birthing gods and more interested in understanding and harnessing Silent Hill's psychological properties. They established research facilities on the town's outskirts, places where they could study the manifestation of trauma into physical form. They recruited psychologists, parapsychologists, and others who could bring scientific methodology to what had previously been purely religious practice. The town itself had become increasingly unstable. Without Alessa's will maintaining a consistent otherworld, Silent Hill's alternate dimensions fluctuated wildly. Sometimes the fog would roll in and transform the town for days. Sometimes the other world would manifest in broad daylight without warning. Sometimes multiple versions of the town would exist simultaneously, with people experiencing different realities while standing in the same physical space. Travis Grady, a trucker with his own psychological burdens, experienced this instability firsthand when he passed through Silent Hill. He encountered the town in a state of flux, with past and present overlapping, showing him events from Alessa's burning that he couldn't have witnessed, but somehow remembered. His journey revealed that Silent Hill was not just reflecting current psychology, but accessing memories and traumas from across time. The Butcher, Travis's personal demon, represented his fear of becoming like his father, who had been institutionalized for violent psychosis. Unlike the Pyramid Head that had pursued James, the Butcher was a prediction rather than a judgment, a manifestation of what Travis feared he might become rather than punishment for what he had done. This suggested that Silent Hill's manifestations were becoming more sophisticated, able to process not just guilt but anxiety, not just past trauma but future fears. Travis discovered that his mother had been involved with the Order, that his family's history was more connected to Silent Hill than he had known. The town showed him suppressed memories of his mother's suicide attempt, his father's breakdown, his own childhood split between trying to save them both and protecting himself from their damage. The Orphanage and Origins. As Travis's journey peeled back layers of Silent Hill's history, the central role of the Order's orphanages became clearer. These institutions hadn't just been places to house unwanted children, but laboratories for understanding how trauma shaped consciousness, and how consciousness could shape reality. The children raised in these orphanages were subjected to carefully calibrated suffering, designed to awaken whatever latent abilities they might possess. Those who showed promise like Alessa with her psychic abilities, or Walter with his capacity for delusion so strong it could reshape reality, received special attention. Those who broke under the pressure were disposed of, their deaths contributing to the spiritual atmosphere the Order cultivated. Documents found in the ruins of these orphanages revealed systematic approaches to trauma induction. Children were isolated for specific periods, exposed to particular fears, forced to confront customized nightmares. The Order had been trying to mass-produce what had occurred naturally with Alessa individuals whose psychological states were powerful enough to influence Silent Hill's malleable reality. Most of these experiments failed, creating only broken children who grew into damaged adults. But occasionally they succeeded in ways the Order hadn't anticipated. Some children developed abilities to see between worlds without rituals or drugs. Others could influence probabilities, making unlikely events more likely through unconscious manipulation of reality. Still others became living conduits for Silent Hill's influence, carrying its reality-warping properties with them wherever they went. The Order's records, scattered and partially destroyed but still readable, suggested that they had been preparing for something larger than just paradise. They wrote of a great transformation when the barriers between all worlds would collapse, when the psychological and physical would become indistinguishable, when humanity would be forced to confront its collective unconscious made manifest. Murphy Pendleton and Justice. The year 2011 brought another visitor to Silent Hill, one whose arrival had been orchestrated through the American justice system rather than the Order's machinations. Murphy Pendleton, a convicted prisoner being transferred to another facility, found himself in Silent Hill after his transport bus crashed on the town's outskirts, though whether the crash was accident or inevitability remained unclear. Murphy's Silent Hill was shaped by his complex relationship with justice and revenge. Years earlier, his young son Charlie had been murdered by a pedophile named Patrick Napier. The justice system had failed. Napier received a sentence Murphy considered too lenient. In response, Murphy had arranged to be imprisoned himself, bribing a corrupt guard named George Sewell to place him in proximity to Napier, whom he then killed in the prison showers. The Silent Hill that Murphy experienced was part prison, part courtroom, constantly judging him while forcing him to judge himself. The monsters he encountered were manifestations of institutional violence, the prisoner minions that attacked in groups like yard gangs, the screamer that embodied the helplessness of incarceration, the bogeyman that represented both Murphy's role as executioner and his fear of execution. Murphy's journey was complicated by the presence of Anne Cunningham, a corrections officer whose own connection to the events gradually revealed itself. Her father was Frank Coleridge, the guard Murphy had made a deal with, but who had been killed by Sewell to cover up the corruption. Anne blamed Murphy for her father's death, not knowing the full truth, and her pursuit of him through Silent Hill created a dual narrative of hunter and hunted. The bogeyman that stalked Murphy was particularly significant because it wasn't always the same entity. Sometimes it was Murphy's guilt manifested. Sometimes it was Anne's rage given form. And in certain circumstances, Murphy himself transformed into the bogeyman, becoming the very thing he feared and fled from. This suggested that Silent Hill's manifestations were becoming more fluid, less tied to individual psychology, and more responsive to interpersonal dynamics. The moral complexity of Murphy's situation challenged Silent Hill's usual function as judge. He had committed murder, but it was of someone who had destroyed his life. He had corrupted the justice system, but only because he felt it had already failed. The town's response was to create scenarios that forced Murphy to confront whether his actions had made him different from or similar to the man he had killed. The Devil's Pit, and the mind's truth. Murphy's exploration led him to discover more about the 1911 mine disaster and its true nature. The Devil's Pit, as locals had come to call the sealed mine, wasn't just a site of tragedy, but a wound in reality itself. The miners hadn't simply died, they had been transformed, pulled into a pocket dimension where they continued to exist in a state between life and death. This pocket dimension, accessible only under specific psychological conditions, revealed that the mine disaster had been the Order's first large-scale attempt to create what Alessa would later achieve naturally. They had deliberately caused the collapse, trapping the miners as part of a ritual designed to thin the boundaries between worlds. The miners' suffering, concentrated and prolonged, had indeed created a rupture, but not the controllable one the Order had hoped for. Instead, the Devil's Pit had become a wild space where multiple realities overlapped without order or meaning. The miners existed simultaneously as they had been, as they were at the moment of death, and as they had become through decades of existence in that liminal space. They were victims, ghosts, and something else entities that had adapted to impossible conditions by becoming impossible themselves. Murphy's connection to the mine came through his grandfather, who had been one of the miners presumed dead, but who had actually escaped the initial collapse. He had emerged from the mine changed, carrying with him knowledge and capabilities that he had passed down through the family line. Murphy's ability to survive Silent Hill's trials wasn't just psychological strength, but an inherited adaptation to the town's reality-warping properties. This revelation suggested that Silent Hill's influence was generational, that exposure to its properties created changes that could be passed down. The Order had been trying to breed individuals capable of surviving and manipulating the town's effects. Alessa hadn't been unique, but rather the successful culmination of generations of selective breeding and trauma induction. The digital influence. As technology advanced, Silent Hill's influence found new mediums for expression. The town's ability to manifest psychological states wasn't limited to physical space, it could exist in digital environments, transmitted through media, spread through information networks like a virus of consciousness. The Order, or what remained of it, had adapted to these new possibilities. They created video games that weren't just about Silent Hill but contained fragments of its essence. Players reported that these games affected their dreams, that they would see fog in their peripheral vision, that the sound of static would trigger anxiety responses that seemed disproportionate to the stimulus. These digital manifestations were weaker than direct exposure to Silent Hill, but more widespread. Thousands of people could be slightly touched by the town's influence rather than a few being completely transformed. The cumulative effect was a gradual increase in reported psychological phenomena worldwide shared: nightmares, collective delusions, reality seeming less stable than it once had. Some theorized that this was the Order's new strategy for achieving their great transformation. Rather than birthing a god through one perfect vessel, they were slowly converting humanity into vessels, preparing the entire species for a collective transformation. Each person touched by Silent Hill's influence became a tiny rupture in reality, and enough tiny ruptures could theoretically create a cascade effect. The games themselves became increasingly sophisticated, reading player psychology through their choices and adapting accordingly. What started as predetermined paths branching based on decisions evolved into dynamically generated content that reflected each player's fears and guilt. Some players reported that the games seemed to know things about them that they hadn't input, that characters would reference real events from their lives, that the monsters they faced were specifically tailored to their personal traumas. The town's current state today, Silent Hill exists in a state of quantum uncertainty. It is simultaneously an abandoned town in Maine, a psychological dimension accessible through trauma, a digital virus spreading through media, and something else that human language lacks words to properly describe. Physical expeditions to the town report different findings. Some find empty buildings and streets, a normal abandoned town with nothing supernatural beyond its oppressive atmosphere. Others experience the full range of Silent Hill's phenomena: fog worlds, other worlds, monsters tailored to their psychology. Still others report finding a town that shouldn't exist, with architecture that defies physics, populated by people who claim to have always lived there, but whose histories don't align with any records. The Order continues to exist in various forms. Some cells maintain the old religious interpretations, conducting rituals and seeking to birth gods. Others have evolved into research organizations, studying Silent Hill's properties with scientific methodology. Still others have become digital cults, spreading Silent Hill's influence through online spaces and virtual reality environments. The individuals who have survived encounters with Silent Hill carry its influence with them. They report ongoing effects, dreams that feel more real than waking life, moments where reality seems to glitch, encounters with people who might be manifestations of their psychology, or might be other survivors, or might be something else entirely. They form support groups that become nexuses for new manifestations, their collective trauma creating weak points in reality. Children of Silent Hill survivors display unusual characteristics. Some have inherited abilities, precognition, telepathy, reality influence that seem connected to their parents' exposure. Others experience Silent Hill's phenomena without ever visiting the town, as if their parents' experiences had been encoded in their genetics. The generational trauma has become literal, passed down through bloodlines, and creating a growing population of individuals naturally attuned to Silent Hill's frequency. Conclusion: the eternal fog. As we reach the end of our journey through Silent Hill's complete timeline, we find ourselves where we began, in a space between sleeping and waking, between what we know and what we fear, between the solid ground of consensus reality and the shifting fog of psychological truth. Silent Hill's story is ultimately not about a town, but about the human condition itself. It's about how trauma shapes us, how guilt haunts us, how the stories we tell ourselves about our suffering can become more real than the suffering itself. Every person who enters Silent Hill, whether physically, digitally, or psychologically, confronts not just monsters, but mirrors, reflections of their inner world made manifest in ways that force acknowledgement. The religious framework the Order imposed on these phenomena, gods and paradise, judgment and transformation, was simply one interpretation of something that might be fundamentally beyond interpretation. Silent Hill might be a natural occurrence, a place where the laws of physics naturally allow for consciousness to influence matter. Or it might be supernatural, evidence of dimensions beyond our understanding. Or it might be psychological, a collective delusion so powerful it creates its own reality. What remains consistent is Silent Hill's function as a space for confrontation with the self. Every protagonist we've followed has been forced to face truths they've hidden, to acknowledge parts of themselves they've denied, to integrate shadows they've rejected. The monsters they fight are themselves. The puzzles they solve are their own psychological knots. The town they navigate is the landscape of their own unconscious. The fog that defines Silent Hill is the perfect metaphor for this function. It obscures but also reveals, hiding the familiar while exposing the strange. It creates isolation that forces introspection. It makes the known world uncertain, requiring navigation by internal rather than external landmarks. And it never fully clears. Even those who escape Silent Hill carry wisps of fog with them, traces of uncertainty that remind them that reality is less solid than it appears. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll dream of fog-shrouded streets and empty buildings that aren't quite empty. Perhaps you'll hear the static of a radio catching signals from nowhere, or the sound of something dragging metal across concrete, or a siren that signals transformation. These dreams aren't necessarily nightmares. They're invitations to explore the parts of yourself you keep hidden, to confront the guilt and trauma that shape your unconscious landscape. Silent Hill teaches us that the real horror isn't in the monsters we might encounter, but in the recognition that we created them. Every creature that stalks its foggy streets is a projection of human consciousness, a fear or guilt or trauma given form. The town doesn't create these things, it simply provides a space where what already exists within us can manifest without the usual barriers that keep our inner and outer worlds separate. The timeline we've traced tonight spans centuries, from indigenous understanding through colonial corruption to modern digital dissemination. But Silent Hill's true timeline is psychological rather than chronological. It exists in the eternal now of trauma, the timeless space of dream, the permanent present of unresolved guilt. Everyone who encounters it experiences it as immediate, personal, tailored specifically to them. In this way, Silent Hill is perhaps the most honest place in all of horror. It doesn't lie about what it is or what it wants. It simply shows us ourselves, completely and without mercy, forcing us to confront what we are when all our comfortable illusions are stripped away. The fog isn't hiding the truth, it's revealing it, showing us that the solid world we thought we knew was always more fluid than we imagined. Sleep now, and if you find yourself walking foggy streets in your dreams, remember that you're not lost. You're exactly where you need to be, confronting exactly what you need to confront. The monsters you meet are messengers. The puzzles you solve are lessons. The town you explore is yourself, turned inside out and made manifest. Silent Hill waits patiently in the spaces between towns on maps, between sleeping and waking, between sanity and madness, between guilt and redemption. It doesn't judge, despite what the order claimed. It simply reflects, showing us what we are when we think no one is watching, when our psychological defenses are down, when we can no longer maintain the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Thank you for joining me on this complete exploration of Silent Hill's timeline. May your dreams be foggy but not frightening. May your confrontations with yourself be healing rather than harmful, and may you wake tomorrow with a clearer understanding of the shadows you carry. The fog will lift eventually, but something of Silent Hill always remains a reminder that reality is psychological, that trauma shapes worlds, and that the only way out is through. Rest well, and remember in Silent Hill, as in life, the real journey isn't about reaching a destination, but about understanding what you discover along the way. The town's streets may shift and change. Its buildings may transform between one glance and the next. But the truth it reveals remains constant. We are all walking through our own silent hills, navigating our own fogs, confronting our own monsters. The siren has stopped sounding. The fog is settling. The transformation is complete. Sleep now, and dream of quiet hills where silence speaks louder than screams.